Morning, church. If you want to go ahead and follow along, we are going to be starting this morning in the book of Nehemiah. I understand this says Ruth, and I've been talking about Ruth. We're going to start in Nehemiah, and you have to trust me how we get there. But we'll be starting in Nehemiah if you want to open your Bibles or your phones to the book there where we will begin. I love the story of Ruth. In terms of books of the Bible, I think it's one of my favorites. It's one of the most, I think, charming and heartwarming stories in all of Scripture. And I'm excited to dive into this with you. And I think it's going to tell us a lot about how God is working in our lives today. And so I'm excited to begin this journey through Ruth with you. And so our starting point this morning is in the year 450 BC or so. Now, this time, 450 BC, is about 130 years, give or take, after what we could call the Great Calamity. And what I mean by the Great Calamity is the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem, in which all of the Israelites have been taken into captivity by the Babylonians and are now in strangers in a faraway land as exiled prisoners and servants to the Babylonian Empire. Now, over the time, different kings come and go, and the Israelites get permission to start returning to their homeland of Judah. Zerubbabel has returned, and he has rebuilt the temple. And now where we are beginning is you have two gentlemen who have returned to Judah and to Jerusalem by the name of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, I've said before that I love the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. They are some of my favorites. I love the whole portion about the rebuilding of the wall. And that delves into when Ezra and Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem, they came with two main goals in mind. The first was to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. Historically, that has always been one of the strong points of Jerusalem is their walls and their physical location. So they've come to return to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And the second is to restore Israel's devotion to the Torah, to the law of Moses. If you think through Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, they want to restore Israel's dedication to the law of Moses, Torah. And of course, if you read through those first 5 books, there are all sorts of different commands about what the Israelites should be doing, to how they should be worshiping God, to how they should be game and interacting with one another. But there are some provisions and some laws regarding how the Israelites are to remain as a pure people in the face of foreign and pagan cultures around them who worship other gods. And one of these such nations that gets mentioned a lot throughout the Pentateuch, throughout the law of Moses, these first 5 books, is the people from the country of Moab. If you've read through it, all the surrounding countries, for the most part, get a really bad reputation, but the Moabites, at least in the Old Testament, are a people of what you could say particular disdain for the Israelites. And so what we're going to do is we're going to lay this foundation, and we're going to look at 4 passages from the Old Testament that start to give you an idea of what the Old Testament teaches us about the Moabites. If we could move forward to one more. There we go. In Genesis 19, I realize now the font is tiny. Apologies. Again, PowerPoints are not my strength. In Genesis 19, it tells us that the Moabites are descendants who came about because of incest. If you can think back to the story of Lot and his daughters, who they have arrived, and his daughters, they don't have any prospects, so they can conceive this plan to say, hey, let us get our father drunk, and then we can each lay with him, so that way we can have offspring and continue our bloodline. It's from this story that Genesis attributes the Moabites being a people who have been born about out of incest. So already that is the first impression that the people of Israel are given about Moabites. In Numbers 22, we have Balak, the king of Moab, and he has hired and enlisted the services of Balaam, the magician, the sorcerer, to place a curse on the people of Israel. If you can recall, this is the sorcerer who has the talking donkey, who the donkey sees the angel in the road and speaks to him and causes him to turn about face. But that story begins with the king of Moab enlisting the help of a sorcerer to place a curse on the people of Israel. So as you can imagine, if you're an Israelite and you're hearing the law of Moses and you're hearing these stories, that's strike two against the Moabites. Shortly after this, because of this failed plan to curse the people of Israel, because Balaam will not do so, Moabites sends their women into the camps of Israel to, you could say, seduce and lead away the men of Israel and to worship their god Baal, and to engage in idolatrous worship as opposed to the worship of Yahweh, to the worship of God. And so, thus far, the Moabites have been billed and described as a people who are working against the Israelites at every step of the way. And Deuteronomy chapter 23, I think, gives us the harshest condemnation of the people of Moab that we can find in scriptures. So I'm going to read this here beginning in verse 3 through verse 6. It says, "No Ammonite or Moabite or any of his descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, even down to the 10th generation. For they did not come to meet you with bread and water on your way when you came out of Egypt. And they hired Balaam, son of Beor from Pethor and Aram Naharaim to pronounce a curse on you. However, the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam, but turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you. Do not seek a treaty of friendship with them as long as you live." Deuteronomy tells us that anyone who is of descendants from the people of Moab are not to be welcomed into the assembly. They're not to be welcomed as people who are a part of the family of God. They're not to be welcomed as people who want to come and worship to God. And if you notice, it's to the 10th generation. That doesn't mean they have to be a full-blood Moab. It just means they have to have had a great grandparent who was Moabite. 10 generations, if that is in their blood, they are not welcomed to be called part of the people of God. That is how serious of a threat and how unholy and pagan of a people the Moabites are considered by the Old Testament authors. They are not welcomed into the assembly to worship God. If you read through Ezra and Nehemiah, you'll notice one of the themes is that as these two men return to Jerusalem, and you have Ezra, who is he's a priest, and Nehemiah, who was a legal policymaker serving in the courts, they've come back and they want to restore Judah, Jerusalem, to its former glory. And they have noticed that there is all sorts of intermarriage between the Israelites and the people of the surrounding cultures, including the Moabites. And as we've said, they've come to rebuild the walls and return people to following the law of Moses. And this problem of people marrying the Moabites needs to be addressed. So we're going to pick up in Nehemiah chapter 13, verses 1 through 4, to give you an idea of the action that Nehemiah and Ezra take to address the presence of Moabites here. So beginning in chapter 13, verse 1 through 4. On that day, the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people, book of Moses being these first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah. The book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people, and there it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God, because they had not met the Israelites with food and water, but had hired Balaam to call a curse down on them. Our God, however, turned this curse into a blessing. And when the people heard this law, they excluded from Israel all who were of foreign descent. The Levites have just read to the entire people this passage in Deuteronomy and looked at together. And upon hearing it, upon that no Moabite is to be welcomed into the assembly of God, they exclude and they send off all of those of foreign descent. Further down in chapter 13, beginning in verse 23, it gives us a more clear idea of the actions that Nehemiah has taken, where it says, "Moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, the Philistines, from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod or the language of one of the other peoples and did not know how to speak the language of Judah." So Nehemiah has arrived on the scene. He sees all these Israelites who have married Moabites and Philistines, and they can't speak the language of Judah. And he continues to saying, "I rebuked them and called curses down on them. I beat some of the men, and I pulled out their hair." Personally, reading this, rebuking them and cursing them, I can see how we got there. He beats them and pulls out their hair. Nehemiah has gone full on aggressive warfare on these men. It reminds me of the story of Phinehas in Numbers. If you can remember just a little bit ago when we talked about how the Moabite woman who came into the camps to lead the Israelite men away, Phinehas in his zeal for the God went and found a tent where an Israelite man and a Moabite woman were laying together and thrust a spear together through the both of them out of his zeal for God. In this passage, Nehemiah reminds me a little bit of Phinehas. Upon seeing this intermarriage, what he might deem the corruption of the law of Moses, he rebukes them, calls curses on them, beats them, and pulls out their hair. "I made them take an oath in God's name and said, 'You are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves. Was it not because of marriages like these that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned? Among the many nations, there was no king like him. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel, but even he was led into sin by foreign women. Must we hear now that you too are doing all this terrible wickedness and are being unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women?'" Nehemiah has just given the command and reminded people that they are not to take foreign sons and daughters to be spouses for their children. They are not to marry. They're not to be engaged in these relationships with foreign men and women. If you've ever read the very end of Ezra, chapter 10, I'm going to give kudos to you because it's a list of over 100 names. And I am guilty of any time I read scripture and I get to a section filled with names, I skip right down to the next part. I'm guilty of it. But if you turn to Ezra chapter 10, beginning in verse 18, we're not going to read all these names, but here it says, is among the descendants of the priests, the following had married foreign women: And then it begins to list every single man in this region who had married a foreign woman. It ends in verse 44 by saying, all these had married foreign women, and some of them had children by these wives. Other translations reinforce what we read in Nehemiah 10 by translating saying, all of these men had foreign women, and their wives and children were sent away. Nehemiah chapter 10 has already told us that all foreigners were excluded from the people of God in Jerusalem. And as we read these passages, it can sound really neat and tidy and buttoned up. Ezra and Nehemiah come back. They reveal the law of Moses to the people of Israel. The law of Moses says, do not marry a foreigner. Do not marry a Moabite. The people of Israel have married Moabites, cast them off, send them away. Now we can begin anew as the pure and holy people of God. And it sounds really neat and cleaned and polished, but it doesn't, in my opinion, tell the full story. If you can imagine that these are families of husbands and of wives and children who are being split apart. Wives and children are being sent away, families divided for ages to come. There's hurt and there's heartbreak here. And when we read these, you can start to ask a couple of questions. One, did everybody agree with this? And then two, did everybody comply? And you can wrestle and rest in that tension there. And that brings us to the book of Ruth. You see, when we read Ruth 1:1, it says, in the time of the judges. The setting for the book of Ruth is back in Judges, but it's during this time period that Ruth was authored. It's during this time period that the author of Ruth, instead of trying to fight fire with fire and policy with Ezra and Nehemiah, it's during this time period, the author decided to remind the people of Israel of a piece of their history in a way that captures their imagination about how they can view outsiders. In this specific case, the Moabites. Later on, 600 years from this time period, Jesus is going to do the same thing when he captures Jewish imagination about how they think about the Samaritans. The author pens this book of Ruth in this time period, and it's this very charming little book that pushes against the policies that Ezra and Nehemiah have been promoting. It pushes against these policies that says husbands and wives need to split apart and children need to be set away. It pushes against this view towards foreigners and outsiders. And it's after all of this backstory that we can finally dive into the book of Ruth. If you turn to the next slide, you can see in our Christian Bibles, we have Ruth placed immediately after the book of Judges. And that makes sense because we've already established that setting-wise, Ruth follows after the book of Judges. We go Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. We continue on in what we call the books of history throughout the Bible. But in the Hebrew Bible, in the Jewish Bible, they have Ruth arranged what they call the writings. They have Ruth right after Song of Solomon. It's included with Lamentations and Ezekiel and Esther and with Ezra and Nehemiah shortly after. Sometimes because of our placement, if we can lose the context for which books are being written. Sometimes it's easy for us to forget that books have all these webs of connection to one another, and Ruth was written in this time period as Ezra and Nehemiah. So beginning in Ruth chapter 1, we can begin with this beautiful, amazing story. As I slowly get there. Now, the amazing thing about the book of Ruth is it's almost the opposite to the book of Judges, which it follows. If you've read through Judges, Judges is arguably the most violent book in all of the Bible. I'm amazed that Hollywood has not yet turned every story into Judges into a blockbuster series because it is filled with violence and war, and there are good guys and there are clear bad guys in the book of Judges. And then immediately we come to the book of Ruth, where there's no violence. No one even really raises their voice. There's no bad guys. It's just a very pleasant and charming story. And it's because the drama of Ruth isn't being played out in the pages. It's being played out in the audience who is reading it. In Ruth chapter 1, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name's Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab, and they lived there. Now, this begins like any other story, and it loses some of its significance when we are just reading Hebrew names of towns and places, and we don't read them with their translation, the meaning of their names. And so I'm going to begin again, but this time I'm going to read the English translations of the names. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from House of Bread in Judah, Bethlehem being house of bread, there is no bread in the house of bread. Together with his wife and sons went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was My God is King, and his wife's name Pleasant. And the names of his 2 sons were Sickness and Mortality/Destruction. Now that is called foreshadowing. There is no bread in the house of bread, and my God is King. Pleasant, sickness, and destruction must go off to the land of Moab, the place that has been taught as a no-go, just so that they can survive. And so they head to the land of Moab. You have to imagine they get settled down. They begin to make roots. And it's there that my God is King dies. It doesn't expand upon how he died. Does it expand upon if it was sudden or if it was a slow? We just know that my God, his King, has died, and it leaves us with pleasant sickness and destruction. Now you can imagine that Pleasant is filled with grief to lose her husband, but her boys are coming of age. They are going to marry, and they're going to bring grandchildren to the family, and there can be some joy and happiness found in the growing of their family. And so sickness and destruction each take on wives. Sickness marries Orpah, which means nape, like the nape of a neck. We'll get there, or what that means. Sickness marries nape, and destruction marries Naomi, friendship. Destruction marries Naomi, meaning friendship. Thank you. I saw some head shaking. I was saying, Ruth. Sickness marries Ruth, named friendship. And you have to imagine things are starting to look up and up. Maybe things are going to shake out okay. And then, if you haven't guessed by now, sickness dies. It doesn't tell us why, but you have to imagine with a name like sickness, that had something to do with it. And then shortly after the death of Naomi's son, sickness, their second son, destruction, mortality, also dies. And now you have a family of an Israelite woman and 2 Moabite women, a family of widows who are all grieving because what must have seemed hopeful and promising has all passed on. You're left with 3 widows. And eventually, we don't know how much longer they stay in the land of Moab, but eventually Naomi makes the decision saying, I can't stay here much longer. I have no roots in Moab. I'm not from here. I need to return back to where I am from. And Orpah and Ruth say, we are going to come with you. And at first, there's not really any pushback. They began traveling back to the land of, to Bethlehem, to the house of bread. And eventually, along the road, Naomi says to her 2 daughter-in-laws, go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. And then she kissed them and they wept aloud and they said to her, we will go with you to the land of your people. We are not going to abandon you. We want to stay with you, Naomi. We want to go back with you to Bethlehem. And Naomi replies to them, why would you come home with me? What do I possibly have to offer to you? I don't have any kids on the way. I'm not married. Even if I got married today and had kids tomorrow, would you wait for them to grow up so you can marry them? I have nothing to offer to you. And it says that, no, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you because the Lord's hand has gone against me. And I have to imagine that they are weeping together. They're crying together. They're embracing one another in hugs. And at this, Orpah, Nape, kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. And Ruth clung to her, and Orpah heads back to the land of Moab, where the last image they see of her is the nape of her neck. Now, when we read this, let's not paint Orpah Orpah's not a villain. There's no bad guys in the story of Ruth. Orpah is just returning to her family. But Ruth, friendship, clings to pleasant, saying, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. And when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. And so the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. Here you have an Israelite woman and a Moabite woman, 2 widows who are returning to Bethlehem, to the house of bread after the famine has passed. And you can imagine that the people who are toiling and they're working the fields and the shops in Bethlehem, and they look up and they start going, is that Naomi? Is that pleasant? Is she coming back? Where is my God as king? And where is sickness and where is destruction? But is that pleasant? And who is that with her? And they are greeted by, maybe you might call them old friends who remember them. And they greet Naomi and they say, pleasant, welcome back. And Naomi replies to them, do not call me Naomi any longer. Do not call me pleasant, but call me Mara. Call me bitter. For the Lord has turned his hand against me. Do not call me pleasant anymore, but call me bitter. And this is where this first chapter, this first episode ends. There's no real resolution to the story. In fact, it's only beginning in that you have Naomi Pleasant, who is now going by Mara, bitter, returning to her homeland, a widow with no sons remaining, with her Moabite daughter-in-law, a widow. By all accounts, they have no prospects. There seems to be very little opportunity for them. There seems to be no way for them to progress forward. They are in a bitter situation. And as we begin to end this morning, we know that although this story is just now beginning, we know how things begin to end. But let me say that if you find yourself in a situation where you just feel bitter and you feel that your story has finished, Naomi thinks her life is over. Right? Her chapters have been ended. The book has been closed. She is going to die a bitter woman who is alone. But God is not finished with her story. And God is not finished with your story yet either. There is more chapters and there are more episodes to come in the life of Naomi and Ruth, and there are more chapters to come in our lives as well. So when we feel like everything has turned against us, have hope because God is not finished yet. As we spend the next times going through the book of Ruth, we are going to see how this story comes to an end. But we know that for us today as Christians, that in times of suffering, we know our resolution, the ending of our story, we know that is found in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So this morning, as we begin to wrap up and as we about to engage in song again, and as you start thinking about the situation of Ruth and of Naomi and the hopelessness there, if you think of hopelessness in your life, I urge you, cling to the hope and the salvation and the safety we have in the arms of your God. If you are seeking comfort, or if you are seeking guidance, and you need help seeing this hope, there are elders and deacons and husbands and wives who would love to support you and help you rest in the presence of God. And I encourage you to come forward as we stand and as we sing.